over the last 2 years, during the pandemic, every type of education saw increases in their numbers except for the fully leaded public schools. So Catholic schools grew a little, alternative programs grew quite a bit, charter schools grew, and home education doubled over the course of the pandemic. And that's largely holding. It doesn't seem like that's a reaction to don't want to go into the room with all the germs. It seems like it's largely a reaction to parents got a good look at the education system and saw what their kids were learning, or sometimes more often what they were not learning. Right. And they got an up close look with all those Zoom classes and work being sent home, and needing more communication with parents to make education work over the course of the pandemic. I think parents got a good lesson in how the education system works or doesn't for their kids.
Adam Soos here for Rebel News, and you're very likely aware of the fact that conversations around education, particularly publicly funded education, very often revolve more so around political ideology and union activism than they do around the quality of education being received by children and parents' choices in education. Well, a group that's seeking to change that in Alberta is the Alberta Parents Union. And in a moment, I'm going to be joined by Jeff Park for an update on the work they're doing.
Sure. So we are parents that have come together to ensure the best possible K through 12 education system in Alberta by empowering parents, making sure parents' voices are more heard. Too often decisions are made without enough consultation, without enough true listening to the parents. So we're trying to make sure that happens more.
And so for maybe folks outside of Alberta, or maybe folks whose parents aren't, or whose kids rather aren't in school presently, Alberta has a bit of a different system. There's sort of some more options. Can you just break that down for people who aren't familiar with how it works here in Alberta?
Okay, I'll try to do the very quick version, where Alberta has, of course, the fully funded public system that everyone has come to expect in every province, but as a part of the Alberta Act, and the very first law established to establish Alberta, we also have fully funded Catholic schools, and Alberta has had the wisdom to retain that separate school system. So you have that automatic competition driving quality there between those two systems. And then Alberta also has unique alternative program schools, which sort of have to differ from the Alberta curriculum. So they have to provide just that yet another bit of competition and decentralization, and so those so they can teach religion, focus on hockey. There are a lot of options for alternative program schools, and then Alberta is unique in Canada for having charter schools, fully funded at the per student level. All the extra avenues of funding usually shut off for charter schools. And then independent schools also funded at 60, 70%, depending on who you ask. And then we have both funded and unfunded home education. So you can have a little bit more of the government supervision every 6 months for funded, a little bit of reimbursement of costs, or you can just promise to follow the schedule of learning outcomes like every Alberta student has to, and go with the unfunded option. So Alberta has more choice in education, more options, and that's really driven quality. Alberta is third in the world in English in language arts generally, because it's not always English in the world, and third in the world in language arts, third in the world in science, eighth in the world in math, and we believe that our quality has largely been driven by those choices, competition, and parents are able to drive quality from the bottom up rather than depending on top-down accountability from a Minister of Education or someone who knows less about these particular children and the needs of particular children.
So it's incredibly interesting. One of the reasons that I wanted to come talk to you, obviously this is very important work. Obviously parents concerned out there, even people who are often apolitical, sort of get into it once education is a question and once education is top of mind. But very interestingly, right as you were sort of getting going, starting to do this work, advocating for things that I think most people would generally agree to: choice in education, better quality education, advocating for parents, you were already effectively canceled even before you got running. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Because there are groups like the Alberta Teachers Association and other groups that claim to speak for parents that a lot of parents are telling me they aren't very effectively heard by, and that can be easily shown by the policies and the principles that are supported by, say, the Alberta Teachers Association, claiming they represent parents that are wildly unpopular with parents. And so the existence of a group like this that actually speaks for parents is an existential threat for a group that claims to speak for parents and doesn't. So it wasn't terribly surprising that they were already after us with hammer and tongs from the beginning. But no one likes to make enemies, but at least we knew it was for a good reason.
Well, it certainly speaks to at least there's some efficacy, or at least some serious concerns being addressed by your group. Now, I want to get into some of the logistics around sort of education, but first off, like so much of the counter narrative that we hear is Alberta education's failing. We need more money. Everything's going awry. And then very often it's either the NDP attacking the current government or the ATA sort of doing its activism that it does. How much of the the educational landscape is political maneuvering, and how much of it is actually trying to provide ideal education for children?
Yeah, unfortunately, the K-12 education system does not, to most of us parents, seem like it is mainly oriented towards serving the students in the education system, but mainly oriented towards serving the adults employed by the education system, whether that be the teachers unions or whether it be politicians and trustees, and it seems like so much more of the conversation is driven by those concerns than by the concerns that really matter to regular parents over kitchen tables trying to help their kids learn. And certainly we see that in these debates where, again, Alberta's world-class education system is painted as if it's failing. And that's because for a government program, if it fails, it gets more money. Whereas if you can have a more competition-based, choice-based structure, then parents actually have to choose to send their children to these schools. Then they actually have to succeed to get more money. A novel concept in education, but what we accept for everything else, including very important things like nutrition, like feeding our families. We understand that competition and the most effective grocery stores getting the most money, the most effective restaurants getting the most money actually makes sense for something like that. It should be the same for education.
Now, outcomes based, I don't know if it's still the case. I know a little while ago, the Catholic system generally did a little bit better than the outright public system, and then charter schools did even better than the Catholic system. Is that still the case?
I think that's generally the case, and I would say that that I don't mind talking about test scores because they do tell us something. And certainly parents do like to have test scores as an option in their toolkit when they're making a decision between schools. But what really tells me that we need these choices and we need more access to more choices is that over the last 2 years during the pandemic, every type of education saw increases in their numbers except for the fully leaded public schools. So Catholic schools grew a little, alternative programs grew quite a bit, charter schools grew, and home education doubled over the course of the pandemic. And that's largely holding. It doesn't seem like that's a reaction to don't want to go into the room with all the germs. It seems like it's largely a reaction to parents got a good look at the education system and saw what their kids were learning, or sometimes more often what they were not learning. Right. And they got an up close look with all those Zoom classes and work being sent home, and needing more communication with parents to make education work over the course of the pandemic. I think parents got a good lesson in how the education system works or doesn't for their kids.
One of the other things you sort of talked about, at least online, is the sort of idea with outcomes based on costs. Do these other sort of choices tend to be more effective as far as bringing costs down, decreasing costs for taxpayers?
Sure. Yes. So between 2010 and 2018, a study by the Canadian Taxpayers Federation and Parents for Choice in Education found that school choice, specifically independent schools and home education, saved the Alberta taxpayer $1.9 billion over the course of those years, and got better results than the public delivery. So certainly that should be across the board. We're getting more value for money in these sorts of schools. Still, we still want the public schools to exist. Still want the Catholic schools to exist. Still want to have all those options available. But that's how, for kids that never go to anything but a public school, which is most kids in Alberta, you still drive the quality by having these other options, and because they still have to compete with these more innovative options with schools of choice.
And now, just again, this goes back a little bit to the structure in Alberta, but on like sort of an equity ground, as far as kids all getting fair treatment, what sort of mechanisms are there in place so someone who maybe wants to go to a charter school or wants to go to one of these other alternatives, if they're afraid they won't be able to afford it, are those kids being left behind, or are there systems in place for that?
Right. So charter schools actually cannot charge tuition in Alberta. They can charge fees the same way a public school could. And certainly because they don't receive the transportation funding that public and Catholic and that the public and Catholic boards receive, then they often have to charge a transportation fee if the parents do want to have a school bus pick their kids up for the charter schools. But because they receive 100% of the per student funding, and because recently the government has given capital funding to the most overbooked charter schools, it really is giving that much cheaper option, to where in Alberta, actually you see the inverse of what you would see in a lot of other provinces, and most of the US states and a lot of other places in the world, where the schools of choice, independent schools, charter schools, home education, have a higher percentage of the lowest quintile earners in Alberta than the fully loaded public schools or even the Catholic schools would. So you're seeing that choice does make it available to families like mine, frankly, where if we were talking about costly tuitions, wouldn't be an option for us.
Right. So I'm struggling to grasp. I mean, other than agency and activism and wanting to push your ideologies and wanting to exclusively fund sort of public education, like, it seems that this will save money, provide better quality education, create a competitive environment so even public education will become better. Are there any downsides to having more choice and more widespread options for education?
There's a major downside for the union in that because other forms, for charter schools, for instance, they can't be a full member of the teachers at charter schools can't be a full member of the ATA. Teachers in independent schools often receive their certification and don't have to be receive their certification outside the ATA and don't have to be members of the ATA. Obviously, home educators don't have to belong to any union whatsoever. Yeah. And so there's certainly a risk for the unions and for their political allies. Yeah. But in terms of, even for teachers, more competition for your services is better for teachers as well. So, no, I think we truly see this with the best studies that have been done, academic studies. We see that everyone is better off the more choices parents have, and the more you trust parents to drive the quality instead of trying to rely on more of a top-down control.
So finally, with obviously the ATA, some of these big unions, some of these advocates, they're sort of heavy hitters. They've got a lot of resources and assets. How do you plan to sort of stand up and advocate for parents in the face of all of that? And if people want to support you, where can they find you?
Yes, absolutely. AlbertaParentsUnion.ca, great website. You can find us there. You can make sure to sign up for our newsletter and hear from us whether the big social media platforms kick us off because of a coordinated campaign or not, whether there's an attempt to cancel us in the future or not. You can hear from us directly, and there's also a join tab where for a tiny fraction, minuscule fraction of the $60.5 million a year that the ATA makes in involuntary dues, we think we can, because our message is so much simpler and so much easier to make, and because we have so many parents who do care so deeply about their kids. We think that with just a minuscule fraction of that amount, we can counter the ATA and be able to make sure that more children have more opportunities in Alberta.
Awesome. Well, that's Jeff Park from the Alberta Parents Union. I want to thank you so much for joining us for this update. Keep us posted on everything you're working on. And for everyone out there, thanks for tuning in. For Rebel News, I'm Adam Soos. Well, I think we can certainly all agree that choice in education is a good thing. We also think that choice in media is a good thing, especially with so many mainstream media outlets right now getting handouts from the government. They're simply unable to ask the important and tough questions. That's exactly what we're here to do. But we don't take money from them. We count on support from people like you, freely chosen support, that is. If you want to support us, one fun way you can do that is by going to rebelnewsstore.com. You can purchase any of our great products there, including the very shirt that I'm wearing. And best of all, it supports our independent journalism. And if you haven't made a purchase before, you can actually use the code ADAM10 for 10% off your order.